When we think of the Renaissance, we picture grand palaces, beautiful frescoes, and wealthy merchants counting their money. But what about everyone else? What about the 90% who lived in poverty? Today we're stepping inside their cramped, smoky homes to see how life really was. Between 1350 and 1650, most Europeans lived in houses that were nothing like those famous Renaissance buildings in your history textbook. These weren't marble palaces or painted chapels. They were tiny two-room cottages slapped together from whatever free materials people could scrounge up, packed with families and sometimes even their animals. Archaeologists have been digging up these forgotten homes layer by layer, and honestly, what they've found is both fascinating and pretty horrifying. Your typical working-class home during the Renaissance was shockingly small, usually less than 40 square meters total. That's smaller than most modern apartments. Picture a space about 20 feet by 20 feet, and that's it, the entire living area for a family of 6 or 7 people, plus whatever animals they kept. These houses stood crammed together in tight rows, whether in growing cities like London and Florence, or in rural villages scattered across Europe. The floor plan was dead simple because poor families couldn't afford anything fancy. First, you had the main room called the hall. This was where literally everything happened. Cooking, eating, working, and often sleeping. It took up most of the ground floor, maybe 2 or 3 meters wide and running the full depth of the cottage. Right in the middle sat an open hearth, basically a fire pit surrounded by clay, where the family cooked and tried not to freeze. There were usually doors at both ends to let smoke escape, though let's be real, it never worked well enough. Next to the hall, separated by whatever the family could cobble together, maybe a timber screen or a mud brick wall if they got lucky, was the inner chamber. This smaller room did double duty as bedroom and storage space. In rural cottages, you'd reach it by climbing a ladder. In cities where every inch counted, builders stacked the rooms vertically. The hall stayed on the ground floor while the chamber became this low attic that actually stuck out over the street, held up by wooden beams. Now let's get into what these houses were actually made of, and this is where being poor really sucked. Rich people built with proper cut stone and solid timber beams. Poor people, they used whatever they could grab for free. In areas with forests, they'd chop down young trees and hack them into rough frames. Where stone was everywhere, they'd gather rubble and stick it together with clay mortar. But the most common building method was something called wattle and daub. Wattle and daub sounds fancy, but it's literally just sticks and mud. Builders would weave thin branches, usually hazel or willow, between upright posts like they were, making a giant basket. Then they'd slather this whole framework with a gross mixture of dirt, straw, and animal dung. Yes, dung. It helped bind everything together and actually made the walls stronger when it dried. The whole mess would get a thin coat of whitewash made from lime, which kept the rain out and made it look slightly less terrible. The genius of wattle and daub was that everything was free. Wood from the forest, dirt from the ground, straw from the fields, and dung from the animals. Get a bunch of neighbors together and you could throw up the walls of a house in a week or two. But man, there were serious problems. Excavations in Kent and Shropshire show these walls were only 3 to 5 centimeters thick. That's barely thicker than your thumb. No wonder church records are packed with desperate requests for help after storms tore houses apart or families were freezing from winter drafts. In coastal areas from Cornwall down to Spain, builders used a different trick called cob. This was basically mud mixed with straw and water, then piled up in layers about 30 centimeters high. Workers would literally stomp on each layer to pack it down, building walls that could be 60 centimeters thick. Cob houses were way warmer and less likely to burn than wattle and daub, and some built in the 1530s are still standing. But cob was high maintenance. Without deep overhanging roofs and constant replastering with lime, rain would literally melt your walls away. Speaking of roofs, pretty much every poor person's house was covered with thatch. This meant bundles of straw, reeds, or broom tied to wooden frames and layered like shingles. Thatch was actually a great insulator, keeping houses warmer in winter and cooler in summer than anything else available. Plus, it was basically free if you grew grain or lived near some reed beds. But thatch had one terrifying problem: fire. One spark from the hearth could turn an entire roof into a bonfire in minutes. One tax record from Nottinghamshire in 1664 lists 7 cottages burned to the ground in a single chimney fire. London tried banning thatched roofs way back in 1212, but poor suburbs just ignored the law because what else could they afford? Some building manuals suggested slapping lime on the edges to stop sparks from catching, but come on, poor families barely had time to eat, let alone fireproof their roofs. Inside these houses, floors were usually just dirt. Only the richest peasants could spring for wooden planks or stone tiles. Some families would spread a second layer of clay mixed with ox blood, which sounds absolutely vile but actually created a hard, somewhat waterproof surface when it dried. Most people just threw rushes or straw on the bare earth. Women would sweep these out every couple weeks and put down fresh ones, a job everyone despised because it kicked up massive clouds of fleas. City officials kept nagging people to pave their floors with tiles, but poor families couldn't afford it. Archaeological digs from Norwich to Nuremberg show layer after layer of compressed dirt, ash, straw, and animal bones, revealing how these floors built up over decades. Each layer is like a time capsule of meals cooked, animals sheltered, and work done in these cramped spaces. Now we hit one of the worst parts of Renaissance poverty: the smoke-filled hall. For most of this period, the only heat and light came from an open fire burning in a clay-lined pit, smack in the middle of the main room. No chimney. The smoke was supposed to drift up and out through a hole in the roof, sometimes fitted with a wooden lantern thing called a louver. But mostly the smoke just hung there in the air, turning the ceiling beams black and making everyone's eyes burn. Studies of skeletons from Tudor Cambridge show exactly what you'd expect: chronic lung problems from a lifetime of breathing wood smoke. The soot was so thick that when archaeologists check out surviving roof timbers from these houses, they find tar and carbon deposits several millimeters deep. Only after 1550 did cheap mass-produced bricks let even moderately poor families build actual chimneys. The poorest kept their smoky open hearths well into the 1600s, slowly destroying their lungs because they couldn't afford anything better. When a family finally scraped together enough for a chimney, it transformed their whole house. Suddenly, the upper floor wasn't choked with smoke, so they could actually sleep up there instead of just storing stuff. But even with chimneys, the air inside stayed nasty. People burned damp wood because dry fuel cost too much, which made even more smoke. They kept fires smoldering all night because relighting them in the morning wasted precious kindling and time. Let's talk furniture, or really, the shocking lack of it. When historians dig through probate inventories, basically lists of everything someone owned when they died, poor households typically had less than 6 pieces of furniture total. A trestle table you could take apart when not eating. A couple 3-legged stools, which worked better on bumpy dirt floors than regular chairs. A wooden chest for the family's few belongings. And the big one, a single bed. That bed was often worth more than everything else the family owned combined. We're talking a wooden frame, hopefully oak if they could swing it, strung with rope to hold up a mattress stuffed with straw or flock, which was basically leftover wool garbage. Lucky families might have a feather pillow and one wool blanket, but blankets were crazy expensive. Historian Chris Dyer figured out that even a cheap blanket cost a farm worker 2 whole weeks of wages. Most families made do with patched-up linen sheets or just piled on more straw when it got cold. The bed usually sat in the main hall, sometimes tucked in a corner with some cloth hung around it for the tiniest bit of privacy. Everyone else in the house, meaning servants, apprentices, and kids old enough to leave mom and dad's bed, slept on straw mats rolled out on the floor each night. The upstairs chamber often stayed full of grain, tools, or other stuff rather than being used for sleeping. which shows you how every single inch of space mattered. This brings us to something that seems totally alien today: communal sleeping. Because beds cost a fortune and space was so tight, entire families piled into the same bed. Parents, babies, older kids, even overnight guests would cram onto one mattress, sometimes lying sideways to squeeze in more bodies. Nobody thought this was weird or wrong. It was just how you survived. And it went beyond families. Female servants often slept in their mistress's bed, both for warmth and to stay safe from creepy men in the household. Travelers at inns thought nothing of sliding into bed with total strangers, sharing the same blanket without batting an eye. During the Little Ice Age, when winters got brutally cold, sharing body heat wasn't just normal. It kept you alive. There were unspoken rules about sleeping arrangements, though. Probate records mentioned truckle beds, basically low frames that slid under the main bed during the day and pulled out at night for servants or kids. Flemish paintings show maids curled, up at the foot of their employer's bed, ready to jump up at dawn and get the fire going. Male apprentices usually crashed in the loft or by the hearth where the master could listen for any trouble. Even in shared beds, everyone knew their place. Irish folklore describes sleeping arrangements that lasted into the 1800s. Daughters against the wall, sons toward the door, parents in the middle. This kept girls protected and boys ready to defend the house if needed. Shows you how even the poorest families used their tiny space to keep order and protect the vulnerable. Water was a constant pain in these houses. Every single drop had to be hauled in wooden buckets from communal wells, or if you were lucky, from spring-fed fountains. This back-breaking work usually fell to women and kids, who might make several trips daily. Once inside, water got stored in wooden barrels or clay jugs shoved in a corner of the main room. Because hauling water was such hard work, families used as little as possible. Historians figure each person used maybe 1 or 2 buckets per day for everything: cooking, cleaning, and brewing small beer, which was way safer to drink than plain water. Washing, whether yourself or your clothes, happened rarely and usually meant the whole family taking turns with the same tub of water. Cities tried making rules about water use for health reasons. Florence and Cologne would fine households that let water barrels sit too long and become mosquito breeding grounds. But poor families usually ignored these rules because they couldn't afford to dump out water they'd worked so hard to haul. Archaeological evidence shows drinking cups found literally next to latrine waste, proving contamination was everywhere and disease was just part of life. Speaking of waste, let's tackle the elephant in the room, or should I say, the chamber pot in the corner. Every night, the same buckets used for water served a grosser purpose. Family members would do their business in these pots, which sat there stinking up the room until morning. At dawn, someone, usually a servant or the woman of the house, would lug them out and dump the contents. Where that waste ended up depended on where you lived. City folks might dump it in a backyard cesspit if they had one. More often, it went straight out the window into the street gutter. London records from 1400 to 1700 are packed with complaints about the horrible smells from housewives making their morning dumps from upper windows. Sure, it was illegal, but good luck collecting fines when literally everyone did it. Rural families had a different setup. Human and animal waste went on the same manure pile, which was actually valuable as fertilizer. Farmers would fork it onto their fields, which saved money but spread nasty parasites everywhere. Studies of medieval cesspits in Brussels found tons of whipworm and roundworm eggs, parasites that loved the cycle between human waste, fields, and food. The Museum of London has preserved some truly revolting artifacts from these cesspits. Not just the expected waste, but also worn-out shoes, torn clothes, and old food bones. These items remind us that poor families threw away basically nothing. What we'd call garbage, they saw as maybe useful someday, even if it was literally sitting in human waste. Here's another shocker. Animals lived inside these houses, too. Keeping livestock indoors, especially in winter, was totally normal. Cows, pigs, and chickens shared the ground floor hall with the human family. Archaeological digs regularly find iron rings in cottage foundations, showing exactly where animals were tied up. People at the time wrote about pigs wandering freely through houses and streets, digging through trash. In winter, having a cow in your house actually made sense. One cow's body heat could raise the room temperature several degrees, which mattered big time when you had no money for firewood. The trade-off was living with the stink and the manure, which piled up in shallow pits and got mucked out maybe once a week. This setup was paradise for vermin. Rats went crazy over spilled grain and food scraps. Fleas multiplied in the straw that both humans and animals slept on. Flies swarmed between manure piles and food with no discrimination. By the 1580s, London was paying professional rat catchers as a regular city expense, basically admitting that rats were now a permanent feature of city life. The air inside these houses was toxic by any measure. Start with smoke from the open hearth, which left everyone's eyes watering and lungs burning. Add ammonia fumes from animal waste, sulfur dioxide from burning coal in mining areas, and what? Doctors called miasma, the supposed disease causing bad air from rotting stuff. No surprise that respiratory infections killed more people than anything else. Modern analysis of surviving roof timbers shows particulate levels many times what we'd consider dangerous today. Scientists studying latrine deposits from Copenhagen found evidence of fish tapeworms and other parasites that spread like wildfire in close quarters. Diseases like smallpox, typhus, and tuberculosis absolutely loved these damp, dark, crowded rooms where families breathed the same stale air for 12 hours every night. Doctors back then knew bad air caused sickness, even if they didn't understand exactly how. They begged for bigger windows and better ventilation. But poor builders couldn't spare wood for window frames, and glass was a total fantasy. The best most families could do was prop doors open in nice weather, which let in fresh air along with cold, rain, and thieves. Cities across Europe kept trying to fix things through laws and regulations. Venice and Pistoia set up health boards during the Black Death that issued tons of detailed rules. Cesspits had to be dug so deep. Night soil carts had to follow certain routes. Streets had to be swept regularly. Houses had to be whitewashed every year to seal up cracks where disease might breed. But enforcement crashed into the wall of poverty. Tenants who couldn't afford food definitely couldn't pay fines for sanitation violations. Landlords just bribed inspectors to look away. When plague hit, authorities focused on quarantine and prayer instead of fixing the crappy housing that helped. Disease spread in the first place. Florence passed a law in 1545 limiting city households to 1 pig each, which tells you something about how many pigs were living in people's houses before that. English law said all cottages had to be lime-washed. Each Pentecost, the religious festival in late spring. But church records show parish after parish letting widows and paupers off the hook because they couldn't afford lime. Not every poor house in Renaissance Europe looked exactly the same. In the Mediterranean, where wood was scarce, but rocks were. Everywhere, poor families built with rubble and sun-dried adobe bricks topped with clay tiles. These houses stayed cooler in summer but followed the same basic 2-room plan. Spanish peasants called the main room the cocina hogar, the kitchen, hearth, which doubled as an animal shelter. The upstairs cambra stored olives and grain and sometimes kids sleeping on straw mats. In the Carpathian Mountains, poor families built log cabins sealed with clay and moss. In Atlantic coastal regions, cob construction created thick earth walls that could last centuries if you kept up with maintenance. But no matter what materials people used, the same problems showed up. Too many people in too little space, terrible sanitation, and constant exposure to smoke and disease. Change happened at a snail's pace. By the late 1500s, mass-produced bricks finally let some working families add proper chimneys. This seemingly small upgrade was actually huge. Smoke stopped filling the main room so families could use upper floors for living instead of just storage. A chimney also created airflow that improved ventilation, cutting down slightly on the toxic indoor air. Brick construction slowly replaced wattle and daub in cities, pushed by fire regulations and running out of timber. These brick houses lasted longer and kept heat better. Some families managed to add a third room, maybe a separate kitchen or an extra bedroom for growing kids. Old animal sheds got converted for human use as livestock moved to separate barns. But let's not kid ourselves about these improvements. Housing surveys from the mid-1600s still recorded thousands of single-room shacks in the countryside. The basic problems of overcrowding, awful sanitation, and contaminated water stuck around well into the industrial age. Living in these houses wasn't just physically brutal, it attacked every sense you had. The sharp smoke made eyes water non-stop. The noise was insane. Babies screaming, adults coughing, chickens squawking, and pigs grunting all in one small space. In cities, add the constant clatter of looms as families did piecework to earn a few extra pennies. But the smells, man, the smells really defined these spaces. Wood smoke mixed with tallow candles, unwashed bodies, and chamber pots created this baseline stench. Throw in boiling cabbage, the go-to meal for poor folks, animal crap, and the earthy funk of damp wattle and daub walls. Preachers loved comparing these smells to the stink of sin, telling people that cleanliness was next to godliness. Yet for the people living there, these familiar smells also meant safety and home. The scent of your own hearth fire and your own animals marked your space as different from the dangerous world outside. Anthropologists who study historical smell cultures found that people connected familiar odors with belonging, even if those odors would make us puke today. Despite the brutal conditions, families figured out ways to make their houses slightly more bearable. Women would scald rush floor coverings with lye to murder fleas before laying down fresh ones. Weekly baking days helped dry out soggy floors. Annual rethatching turned into neighborhood work parties where everyone helped each other, making necessary maintenance into social events. Social customs evolved to deal with zero privacy. Visitors knew to keep it short when there were only a few stools to sit on. Godparent networks shared stuff like extra blankets during childbirth or sickness. The open hearth, for all its problems, created a natural gathering spot where old folks passed down stories, work skills, and prayers to the young ones. The evening hearth circle was often the only education poor kids ever got. By firelight, they learned counting rhymes, religious lessons, and the skills they'd need to survive. Lots of memoirs from this time remember these moments with surprising fondness, suggesting that human connection could beat physical hardship. So, what's the bottom line about these dark, dirty, crowded homes? They weren't leftovers from medieval times, but logical responses to poverty and what materials people could get. Every feature, from the two-room layout to the communal bed to the dirt floor, showed families making the best of terrible options. The hall and chamber plans saved heat and kept taxes down. Wattle and daub turned farm waste into walls that sort of kept weather out. Shared sleeping stretched limited bedding and fuel. But we can't sugarcoat how awful these conditions were. The same features that helped families survive also bred disease and misery. Open hearths warmed the room but wrecked lungs. Animals inside provided heat but spread parasites. Crowded quarters built family bonds but also spread every infection. Terrible sanitation wasn't a choice, but the result of infrastructure that wouldn't exist for centuries. Understanding these humble buildings gives us a fuller picture of the Renaissance beyond fancy palaces and art. For every Michelangelo painting a ceiling, thousands of mothers were sweeping rush floors. For every merchant counting gold in his townhouse, hundreds of families counted pennies in smoky hovels. These dark, dirty, crowded homes sheltered most Europeans during one of history's most celebrated eras. Full of Renaissance treasures, maybe we should think about the workers who lived in houses made of mud and straw, who slept six to a bed, who breathed smoke every single day of their lives. They were part of the Renaissance, too. keeping civilization running from their dark, dirty, crowded homes.